right, so these are our notes on energy flow through an ecosystem. So we've learned about different interactions within an ecosystem. So let's talk about how energy flows. If you need a piece of paper or at least your Cornell notes from Google Classroom open to take notes. All right, so our essential question here is, how do organisms obtain energy in an ecosystem? All right, so there's a couple roles or jobs in an ecosystem that we've talked about a little bit. So each organism in an ecosystem has a role, or like we learned here, a niche, right? A certain place that they can only occupy. And a producer's role is they make their own food through photosynthesis. So those are our plants, things on the ground, and it converts sun's energy to make glucose. And you'll see in a minute, they will provide food for the first and third level consumers, okay? Some examples, any plants, grasses, shrub, trees in the ocean, like algae. And then we have our first level, what we call consumers. So that's our first level. Those are ones that are going to eat our producers, and those are our herbivores. And they must consume another organism to obtain energy, and they only consume plants, okay? And they provide food for second and third level consumers, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And the examples here are deer, rabbits, rodents, mice, rats, squirrels, insects, herbivorous birds, so you don't have vultures and stuff, and etc. So this is what we call our first level consumer, and they are our herbivores, and they only eat plants. Our second level consumers are our carnivores, and they must consume another organism to obtain energy, and they only consume other consumers, okay? And they provide food for our third level consumers. And so examples there are snakes, foxes, predatory birds, jellyfish, etc. And our third level consumers that we call about are our omnivores and our large carnivores, okay? So they must consume another organism to obtain energy, and they consume other consumers and or producers. So those are our omnivores, okay? They eat meat or plants. And they provide food for what we call scavengers. Examples would be humans, lions, bears, sharks, and whales. And then we have our scavengers role, and they must consume another organism to obtain energy, and they only consume dead animal remains. And they provide food for other scavengers. So when they die, they actually provide food for other scavengers. So examples of those are hyenas, buzzards, flies, and snails. We also have decomposers. So those are part of our ecosystem, and they must consume another organism to obtain energy, and they break down dead plant and animal remains, and they provide food for other organisms. Things like fungi, bacteria, and earthworms all break down and help decompose material. So some examples here. Bacteria are what we call decomposers that break down animal remains. A fungus are decomposers that break down plant remains. And the role for both is returns materials to the soil. So remember, everything comes around and everything dies, and it feeds the decomposers and the scavengers. And then the rest of it actually goes back down into the soil to actually bring it back up to the producers and start the whole cycle over again. So some things we're going to play with in the next week are going to be food chains. It shows one possible path for the flow of energy for a particular organism in an ecosystem, and we'll practice that. And the rules for a food chain, there's a couple rules, is you must start with producers to first level consumers to second to third and so on. And you must use arrows to show the direction of energy flow. So when you do an arrow, you start with this point at the organism that is eaten, and the energy you show it goes to the organism that is eating it. All right, so let's look at some examples. So here is our grasshopper, okay? And notice the frog eats the grasshopper, so the energy goes from the frog to the or from the grasshopper, sorry, to the frog. And then the snake eats the frog, so the energy goes from the frog to the snake. And then the hawk eats the snake, and it goes, so the arrow goes from the snake to the hawk. And here's another one. It doesn't have to be in a straight line. It could be in a little circle. We have our plant, and the worm eats the plant, so the energy goes to the worm. Then the turtle eats the worm, and then the eagle eats the turtle. Okay, so this is just one possible flow, is what we call a food chain. Okay. Another example could be a food web, and this is many overlapping food chains in an ecosystem, and we call it a food web. We'll look some examples in a minute. And it shows relationships and dependency to others. So some rules about when you make a food web is you must start with producers, the first level, producers, 2 first level consumers, 2 second, 2 third, and so on. And you must use arrows to show the direction of energy flow. Arrows may overlap. So remember, those arrows go from who is being eaten to who is eating. Okay. So here's an example of a food web. And notice there's a bunch of different arrows. So basically, it's a bunch of different single food chains put together. So you usually organize it in a table, and you have your producers. Okay, so here in this ecosystem, we have some salt marsh plants, aquatic plants, okay? And then our primary consumers, those would be our herbivores. And so insects, and notice the arrow goes to the insects, eat the salt marsh plants. The algae, the fish eat it. And also, not sure what these are, little slugs, I'm guessing, in the salt marsh. And then snails eat these. So notice we have even multiple arrows going up. And so now we have our primary, now we need our secondary. Remember, these are our carnivores, okay? And so a rat will eat the insects, and so will the frog. For the fish, the frog will eat it, and so will the bigger fish. Our little slugs, frogs eat them and fish eat them. And for snails, big fish eat them. And notice there's also an arrow which can happen all the way up to the birds, because the snails also eat the birds also eat the snails, but they are our tertiary, which is our omnivores, okay? And so a snake will eat the mouse, but also our quaternary, our 4th level, our hawks up here will also eat the rat. And notice that's why the arrow goes all the way up here. And then the snake will eat it. The snake will also eat the frog. The crane will eat a frog. Okay, the duck will eat the big fish as well as the crane. And the sparrow, not only will it eat the snails down here in the primary ones, right? It'll eat the snails, but it will also eat some of these producers, okay? But those arrows aren't in there because it's just the show of the energy, okay? And then the hawk will eat all the tertiary consumers. So they are what we call like the top of the food chain. Like a lot of people talk about lions, okay? Let's look at another one. So here is it looks like a little forest, okay? And so we have down here, we have bacteria, decomposers, and fungi all the way down here, okay? And so you can see this bacteria and fungi and stuff will feed our producer, our oaks here, which is eaten by our mouse. But as these decompose, they also give back to here. So notice we have a bunch of circles. And the same here, it'll go to the pine cone, our producer, but as these decompose, it comes back to here. And the red ones are showing our return decomposing back into our soil. Okay, so we always add our soil also usually in our food web because that brings it back. And what would happen is as the golden crowned kinglet dies and the red-tailed hawk dies and the snake dies and the mouse dies, okay? And there should even be one from the salamander. As they die, they put all these nutrients back in the soil, which then goes back up and ends up back in our producers, which then does our primary, notice it's a 1, our secondaries here, which are herbivores, our tertiaries, which are our carnivores, and then we have even ones that go up, which are our omnivores. Okay, so we will actually be doing one of these in class. Okay. All right, here's a last one here. So we have our producers, our first level, our second level, and our third. And then we have our decomposers, which will always be our fifth level. So notice as it starts, we have fungi here, and everything comes back down into our decomposers, fungi, to come back up and hit back to our producers and first level consumers, okay? And so you can see this is what a food web does, is there's multiple flows of arrows. All right, a couple other things that we'll play with this week, which we will learn about, are called energy pyramids. And that just shows the flow of energy in a food chain, and with less energy at each level as it goes up. So one of the rules we follow when we do an energy pyramid to show it is that actually only 10% of the energy gets passed to the next level. 90% of the energy is actually lost to the environment. Because if you remember, I'm sure you've heard it before, you cannot create or destroy matter, and energy is a type of matter. And so energy has to go somewhere. If it doesn't go from the producer to the primary consumer, then it has to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear. So a couple rules when we're doing energy pyramids, and you'll make one, is producers go on the bottom and third level consumers on top. And you must have more producers, first level consumers, more first than second, and more second than third, etc. It's a pyramid, right? You can't have a smaller level underneath a larger level, or the pyramid would fall over, okay? And so here's an example and some words that we use. So we call, and you'll hear me say it, the first trophic level, the second trophic level, and the third. And what does that mean? That means we have our producers, our primary consumers, and our secondary consumers, and then our tertiary consumers are usually on top, fourth. So we call these on an energy pyramid, we call them trophic levels. And it just shows that there's much more energy down here in producers. And then notice it gets smaller because we only get 10% put up, and then 10% here, and then 10% here. So it really shows that as the energy is passed, and we'll do the bucket lab to kind of model that, as the energy is passed, it gets smaller and smaller, okay? And so the producers are our first, the herbivores are our second trophic level, carnivores are our third, and carnivores, tertiary consumers, are our fourth, okay? So when we use it, first of all, we can make a food web and then go ahead and make a energy pyramid. And here's an example of one here. And you can see that only 10% gets moved. So one of the measurements of energy, and you'll learn more about it in chemistry as well, is kcals. We call it kcalories. You actually know it as calories on the back of a bag with nutrition facts. And so producers, if they start with 1,000 calories or kilocalories, then 10% of that will be passed to our primary consumers, which is only 100. And then 10% of that 100 will be passed to our secondary, makes it 10. And then 10% of that 10 will be passed to the top. So actually, when we get to our tertiary consumers, you can see out of 1,000 calories, 1 calorie gets passed to our owl. Okay, and here's another kind of show of a pyramid. You have producers, primary consumers, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. I know I can never say it. Okay, and here's another kind of picture like of Africa. So you have the plants, the giraffe eat the plants, and then the lion eats the giraffe. And notice only probably not very much of the original energy here in the plants gets passed up to the lion. We'll also talk about some other vocabulary words you hear me say when we're talking about modeling these food webs and energy pyramids. Is there's two types of organisms. We have autotrophs, which are organisms that make their own food. So I always think auto, it doesn't have to add in energy, and those are pretty much our producers, so plants. And then you'll hear me say words like heterotrophs, and those are organisms that cannot make their own food. They must consume. So consumers, scavengers, decomposers. So pretty much on our food web, you've got our autotrophs on the bottom, and everything else is what we call heterotrophs. Okay. All right, so that is the end of our energy notes in an ecosystem. So go ahead and process your notes, highlight any important notes, make connections to any of your notes in the left-hand column, write any questions you may have in the left-hand column, and then use your highlights, connections, and questions for your summary, and make sure that you write a 3 to 5 sentence summary before submitting them. If you have any questions, please let me know.